We did not even devote sufficient time and energy to investigating the crimes committed and the people behind those crimes. Instead, our so-called conservative president, with the backing of so-called conservative people, reacted pretty much as that other party we have been rightfully criticizing here at this conference. What we are talking about today is our reaction to 9/11, because that is really what the war on terror has been, a reaction, not a strategy. This reaction, like most poorly thought out reactions, has been anything but conservative. Furthermore, it has led to conditions and changes in this country that are anything but those a true conservative would desire or hope for. Massive growth in spending, new permanent and centralized government institutions, and worst of all, an incredibly stupid militarization of the pursuit of terror. It is the stupidity in the strategy that I want to briefly review. And to do this, no one here needs to understand the least bit about military history, tactics, and strategy. You do not need to know about the Chinese general Sun Tzu, because apparently no one leading the Pentagon is reading him. Sun Tzu understood that understatement and deception is necessary in war. He said, "Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby, you can be the director of the opponent's fate." Instead, our approach has been to almost randomly identify countries and governments and very publicly go after them. The only mystery of our military and foreign policy since 2001 is in the minds of the American people, who do not understand why the war isn't won yet, and why the enemy seems to be expanding, getting smarter, and hating us more. Sun Tzu said, "If ignorant both of your enemy and yourself, you are certain to be in peril." He was right about that, but in fact you wouldn't know it from the obscene confidence and outright idiocy put out by the Pentagon and eagerly embraced by two presidents. One is so-called conservative, the other a left-wing socialist. We, as conservatives, ought to care about getting back to an old kind of normal, not creating a new normal of unconstitutional government, unsupportable debt, and endless war. We should want victory in the war on terror, but understand that victory must include a return to small government republicanism. Sun Tzu wrote, "He who knows when he can fight and when he cannot will be victorious." But as I said, those creating, pursuing, advertising, and selling the so-called war on terror have not read Sun Tzu and cannot be bothered. Von Clausewitz is another strategist we study in the military finishing schools. One thing Clausewitz knew that conservatives also know is that the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking. But instead, we're still debating the question of what is this war on terror. More and more we are asking, why isn't it working and when will it end? Instead of Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz, our strategy has been more theatrics than tactics, and running on a script written by those who stand to benefit from more government and more government spending than those Americans who are fundamentally conservative and who in their hearts do value the Constitution, which is to say the majority of Americans. From a Pentagon standpoint, it was fortunate that the Pentagon was one of the 9/11 targets. Had the Pentagon not been targeted, and had it emerged unscathed on 9/11, it is likely that serious questions would have been asked about why the premier and best funded military, with the best and most highly funded intelligence agencies in the world, was a blind, paralyzed, sitting duck on 9/11. Instead, no serious or probing questions were asked about the appropriateness of our massive military-industrial complex. After 9/11, the so-called conservatives in charge, instead of taking wise counsel, did what any decent Democrat would do. They threw unlimited piles of money at a largely undefined and misunderstood problem. Some in the GOP are still wondering why the Tea Party movement evolved. Didn't people already have a conservative political party representing their interests? Well, the GOP promotion of the war on terror, using big contracts and bigger government, trampling the Constitution, all in the name of fear and empire. None of this approach was conservative. Beyond being anything but conservative, the war on terror, as we have conducted it since 2001, is simply not succeeding. In many of our overseas battles, we are creating and growing new terrorists, and smarter terrorists. We are increasingly exposing our own weaknesses in terms of occupation and counterinsurgency, and even as we institutionally learn from our mistakes, it is always too slow, always after the fact. We, as conservatives no less, seem to be supporting a vague and extremely Clinton-esque policy of global nation building. We keep hoping that putting another one of our crooked guys in charge of the country will work, and we keep hoping that military and economic blackmail can keep the locals in line. That's just idiotic. It may be that our military policy is not designed to reduce terror at all, but is instead simply designed to evolve hand in hand with the so-called war on terror in order to maximize the opportunity for growth of American intelligence and security institutions, permanent institutional growth. Many predictions about the next decade have been made in the past weeks. One thing not predicted for 2010 is a reduction of American forces, or fewer American interferences and entanglements overseas. No one is predicting the ending of America's illegal wars, or even the ending of a front on just one of those illegal wars. Curiously, government spokesmen are aware that this is exactly what Americans want to hear, and they are beginning to pander. Case in point, JCS Chairman Admiral Mullen on The Daily Show last month. How many people saw that? Anybody see him? He was there. He's discussing how we are coming out of Iraq in 18 months, and how the U.S. military is 40% smaller than it was at the end of the Cold War. Mullen represented his case well, but unfortunately he was lying on both counts. Coming out of Iraq, as mentioned previously, 50,000 troops will remain there permanently in our permanent installations. In terms of the size of the military, he is also misleading, or I would say the word lying. In 1988, about a year before the end of the Cold War, the Congressional Research Service Chronology of Military Spending put the DoD take at $451 billion, annual take, in 2005 dollars. In 2009, latest one that we had, the DoD got $10 billion more dollars than they had at the end of the Cold War. Their budget was $460.5 billion, again in 2005 dollars, adjusted. The real military budget in 2009 was larger, not smaller, than at the end of the Cold War. But there's more, namely the modern habit of funding any actual wars the DoD may be fighting through separate supplemental congressional appropriations and authorizations. Admiral Mullen also mentioned on The Daily Show that our uniformed military was smaller today than at the end of the Cold War, smaller in terms of people. It's true, we do have about 750,000 fewer troops than we did at the end of the Cold War. However, for the past 20 years, we've been outsourcing all kinds of formally uniformed specialties and subspecialties. As one conservative economist correctly wonders, and I quote here, was the outsourcing really about saving money, or was it a way to ramp up the effective size of the fighting force without having to institute a draft or some other means to increase the size of the military, e.g. increasing pay substantially, and perhaps sending a few, more than a few actually, bucks in certain directions. The future, especially the future for people who love and value American liberty, is in danger. It is in danger in part because we did not pursue and are not today pursuing a conservative approach to reducing anti-American terrorism and ensuring the guilty were indeed punished for their acts. After 9/11, a ruthless, tragic, terrible event burned into our minds and into our hearts, the United States had alternatives. We could have, as we had done in so many other cases of terrorism, pursued the criminals through a system of law enforcement. This would have meant a slower process, a process that would have been less emotional and less political, and would have required international police and intelligence cooperation. After 9/11, we had the sympathy of the world and strong offers and guarantees of their support.